I'm with Don Mathis on Leadership Lessons. Brother Don, it's so good to see you. You look great. Thank you for joining Leadership Lessons.
I'm honored to be here. Thank you for asking, and delighted to share with you and Kentucky Baptist today.
Brother Don, you're well known in Kentucky. So tell us, for folks that may not know you as well, how did you come to know the Lord? Where are you from? How did you end up being called into ministry?
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, my mom and dad didn't go to church much at all when I was growing up. My dad was a sharecropper. So we lived a variety of places, all in Christian County here in Kentucky, but we moved about. Occasionally, I'd go to church with somebody. If anybody asked, I'd go. So the neighbors periodically, maybe another kid would say, "Why don't you go to church or Sunday school with us?" And I would go, and always enjoyed going, but my folks didn't go much. My sister, I was number 6 in a family of 7, so one of my older sisters was invited by another teenage girl to go to a revival meeting. Unfortunately, it was not a Baptist revival, but it's a good, solid church, believes the Bible. She got saved, and the preacher must have said something about a family altar or reading the Bible or praying or something. So she decided to do that. And she got the idea that it ought to be 2 or more people, and my little sister was, really, she had not been born at that point, or she was about a year old. And so she drafted me, and she'd read the Bible and pray, and sometimes she'd make me pray. So at 13, I got under conviction. I didn't know words like that then. I just knew I was in a mess. I'd heard about hell. I didn't want to go there. I'd heard about heaven. I knew that's where I wanted to go. About all I knew was if I asked Jesus not to let me go to hell, he wouldn't. If I asked him to take me to heaven, he would. And I got saved. I asked him to forgive me and save me. He came into my life. Now, again, we were still not going to church very much. And so it was a couple of years before I made a public profession of faith. My sister, the sister I'm talking about, married a Baptist young man who was a faithful Christian.
Wow. And
so they were going to church the whole deal, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. And so she said, "You're going to church with us." Well, with my sister, I never really had much choice. When she told me to do something, I just did it. So I started going to church with the Pleasant Hill Baptist Church in northern Christian County. Uh-huh. And after I'd been going to church for a while, I went forward, made a profession of faith, and active in the church. My sister and brother-in-law moved away. My Sunday school teacher, whose daughter, by the way, happens to be a member at Eastwood, where I'm a member. My Sunday school teacher, he and his wife and kids would drive 4 or 5 miles out of the way to pick me up to go to church. I lived in Hopkinsville by then, and it was out in the country. The church is. And so I became very active in the church. Then after a while, we moved to a different part of town. It was real close to where my pastor lived. And I would go to church with my pastor. So I got to know him and some things about the ministry. And I literally learned to drive on my pastor's automobile.
Wow.
And anyway, and when he was preaching, I just felt like that's what I'm supposed to do. And that was the strangest thing, because I was so shy. I couldn't carry on a conversation. I certainly couldn't speak to a group, even a Sunday school class. But it seemed like that the Lord was saying, "That's what I want you to do." And so in a revival meeting, our annual revival meeting, I went forward and told my pastor that God had called me to preach. And so that led to a counseling session where he spent about an hour trying to talk me out of it, and pretty much did for some months to follow. And he offered all kinds of alternatives of what I could do and that kind of thing, but I couldn't get away from that. So then he scheduled me to preach student night at Trinity Baptist Church in Hopkinsville, his home church, and it was a mess. I mean, it was a mess. And then I preached the next Sunday night at Pleasant Hill, and it was a worse mess. And so I decided, well, he's right. I missed it. It's not what I'm supposed to do. So I went for about 8 months. In the meantime, I was going to school at Murray State by then, and I was going to be a math teacher. My favorite teacher was a math teacher, and she convinced me that I need to be a math teacher too. And so I just gave up this idea of preaching. Well, I knew I was supposed to, but I pushed it aside. And when I get somebody really insist, I preached a little more about 8 or 10 months after that. And then I walked out of a church one Sunday morning, and I'll just say what I said to God. "God, if you'll leave me alone, I ain't never going to do that again." And fortunately, he would not leave me alone. And our church had a new pastor. And when he came, he said to me one day, he said, I understand you've been called to preach. I kind of hesitated. And I said, yes, sir. He said, why don't you preach?
Hmm.
I don't remember what I said, but I kind of walked away and so forth. And we were having simultaneous revivals. You're old enough to remember when we used to have those. So he stood in the pulpit one Sunday morning and announced that we were going to have participate in simultaneous revivals. And he said, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to preach one service, and Donnie's going to preach the next service. And he hadn't said a word to me about it. And I thought, I'm going to pass out right here. Anyway, so we did. And I had told the Lord in the meantime, I dropped out of college and went through about a year of working at a factory. And miserable, absolutely miserable. And I finally told the Lord, I'll go back to school. I'll preach anywhere that if you'll help me, I'll preach anywhere you give me opportunity to preach. Well, in that simultaneous revival, I discovered something had happened. It made more sense. I could preach. And so then about that time, of course, there was a Baptist college in Hopkinsville, Bethel College.
Yep.
Bethel College closed in 1964.
Mm-hmm.
I did not go to Bethel. By then, I was going to Austin Peay when I went back to college. But up until then, whenever the country churches in particular, needed a supply preacher, they'd get one of the Bethel preacher boys. Well, when the college closed, they were no longer available. So people like me became in demand. And I was working, going to school. I was working in a department store selling shoes, 28 hours a week to pay for my school. And a deacon from Crofton Baptist Church came by one night. And he had been there before. He was a talkative guy. And he said, I understand you're a preacher. I said, yes, sir. He said, we don't have a pastor. Would you preach for us? I said, yes, sir. He said, I'll check back with you. So I'll get back with you. Well, a couple of weeks later, he came back, or maybe a week later, he came back and he said, could you preach for us on September the 20th? That was in 1964. I said, yes, sir. So I preached for him on the 20th. And that night after the service, the chairman of the search committee came up to me. He said, would you preach for us next Sunday? I said, no, sir. I'm scheduled to preach at Olivet next Sunday. You know the places I'm talking about.
Yeah, I do. I know both of them. Yep.
But I'm scheduled to preach at Olivet. Then he said, well, would you stay here for a minute? I said, well, yes, sir. Well, he must have talked to some of the other committee, or maybe all of them. I don't know. He came back a little later. He said, how about you preaching for us the next Sunday and preach for us until we tell you differently? I said, okay. Then I preached for them 3 or 4 weeks, and they said, how about you being interim pastor? I don't really know that I knew what interim was, but they assured me I was living at home, single, living at home. I could live where I was living, and I could go to school, keep going to school. So I said, okay. So then about 2 months later, maybe 3, they said, why don't we ordain you, get you ordained, and you move down here? I said, okay. So they ordained me on the 27th of December, 1964. My brother-in-law, who was a godly influence in my life, preached the ordination sermon as a deacon. He and my sister later on would go to Liberia on the coast of West Africa to stay 2 terms until she caught a baby dysentery and had to come home.
Yeah.
So they were a big influence on my life, big time. And then, by the way, they went back to England. He was a missionary, the equivalent of a director of missions for one of the, I guess, associations in England.
Yeah.
For a while until he died over there. Anyway, that's how I started out at Crofton, was just supply preaching, interim pastorate, and then pastor altogether 2 years.
Those churches raised you. You know, just hearing your story, so many relationships. Your sister was involved in you coming to faith. Your pastor involved and you surrendered to ministry. Another pastor scheduled you to preach. I love that. That's my favorite calling story. Don, you're up next Sunday. If you're called to preach, we're going to find out if you're called or not. And
that's just about the way it happened.
Yeah, well, that's I love the story. So let's talk about preaching a little bit. You've been preaching for more than 60 years. You're an expert in terms of experience. You've logged a lot of hours, and you've preached in probably more Kentucky Baptist churches than any other living person. Is that fair?
That's what Adam Greenway said, and
Well,
he
okay.
started that rumor. I don't know for sure that it's true.
You preached it a bunch of them.
I didn't start the rumor, but I fan it every now and then.
So you've preached a lot of sermons and you've heard a lot of sermons. What are 2 or 3 keys to a good sermon?
Well, it definitely needs to be biblical.
Yep.
You got 2 situations involved. Holy Spirit is directing the process, of course, but it has to be biblical and it has to connect with the people. That's the 2 things that are essential. If you preach a deep theological sermon, they don't understand it, it's useless.
Okay.
Or if you say a bunch of words and it's not from the Bible, that's worse than useless. So those 2 things are essential.
Okay, let's talk about that connecting part. So the biblical part, I think right now Kentucky Baptists are pretty strong. Our pastors are preaching biblical sermons. If you go to any Kentucky Baptist church, for the most part, you're going to hear a text of Scripture explained and applied. That's what pastors are doing. Let's talk about that connection part. Have you ever had a sermon that just didn't connect, like you're preaching it and it just feels like it's kind of falling flat?
I have, but I've also learned that I'm not a good judge of how effective it is.
Okay, well, talk about that a little bit.
Well, sometimes that I think, that just didn't go. And then I have 2 or 3 people come forward and get saved,
Okay.
or they say something to me on the way out that, not just preaching a sermon, but something that I know that they connected. I'm not a good judge.
So Don, you've preached a lot of sermons, you've preached a lot of revivals, so you've left some sermons thinking that didn't connect. How do you comfort yourself? Mondays are hard for lots of pastors. How do you comfort yourself when you personally feel like it didn't connect? What have you learned that's helpful?
Well, first thing is to ask yourself, was it my fault? Did I just miss the target? I don't wallow in that. Tomorrow, at least next Sunday, there will be another opportunity to preach. Learn from it. What should I have done differently? Was it my fault? Or did somebody have a heart attack in the middle of the sermon or something that I couldn't control? Then mostly just learn from it what you can and move on.
Yeah.
But connecting with people is essential. You need to know your people. And I don't mean just 7 or 8. Most of us hear 7 or 8 people and we don't really hear anybody else.
Uh-huh.
I'll talk about that in a minute otherwise, but when you first get to a church, don't get in too big a hurry to do things except preach and love the people. But don't get in too big a hurry to learn the people and listen to them and drive. When you go out to make a visit, go a different way than you've ever gone before.
That's good advice.
And at least drive by where the majority of them work, if they work in a factory or somewhere where they're together, a lot of people together.
Yeah.
I grew up on a farm, never wanted to be a farmer, but if they're farmers, go out and see what they're doing.
Yeah.
Get to know the people a bit. And of course, Crofton taught me that. When I moved there, when I moved on the field, I was still single. I moved into parsonage. If you can imagine a 20-year-old kid moving into parsonage by himself.
I was 24, 26,
Is that right? Okay.
Same thing, single. I was single. Moved into New Hope Parsonage in Trigg County, single.
I know where that is too. Anyway, I knew where to get a sandwich. I knew where to get a free meal. Whatever I needed. If I messed up, they looked the other way or corrected me, depending on whether it was something that. Anyway. Well, get to know your people, and of course, I have used humor a lot through the years. You probably know that. That's a way that I use. I preached until I moved to Central Corbett without much humor at all. The mountain folks taught me how to laugh, and because they like to laugh at themselves.
Yeah, that's good.
They like to laugh, and I changed some things at that point in time, and humor has been good to me, and that disarms people.
So Don, let's talk about that connecting part. I think what you said there is really important, that we may be the worst judge on whether or not our message is connecting. So we may misread the faces of the people that we're preaching to. we may misread the fact that there's not a verbal response like amen or something like that. Has that happened to you? And how did you get over then misreading people and then deciding that you're not the best judge on connecting? When did that happen in your ministry that you got past?
If I don't get any response from the people, I coach them a little bit. I teach them how to say how to say amen, how to nod their head, and congregations where I preach.
I've seen you do that.
They'll say that. Things like that. Of course, I picked that up from Adrian Rogers. A lot of other things I picked up from Adrian Rogers along the way. But mostly listening. I still don't talk a lot. If I don't know you, I don't talk a lot, not much at all. But to listen to people and learn what their concerns are, and pretty much most people have the same concerns.
Yeah.
They got a guilt problem. They're afraid to die, and they're looking for a purpose in life.
Wow. Well, that's worth the time of listening to our conversation right there. Guilt problem, afraid to die, and looking for a purpose and meaning in life. If a pastor has those three things figured out, that qualifies most of the folks we're talking to. Well, let's get on where you were headed a while ago. So you wrote a book called, I think it's called Thriving in Ministry, or not just, you have a copy with you. I've read the book, Surviving and Thriving in Today's Ministry. Good book, certainly worth reading. Let's talk to that pastor who's in the first year of a new church. You were kind of already giving him advice. So what should a pastor be trying to do year one in a new place of ministry?
Well, when it gets there, first of all, don't try to visit every shut-in the first month.
Okay.
They haven't been visited in 20 years. They can wait another month or two. And spend time with your family. Families often get neglected when you get there, particularly if you've got children.
Wow.
They get neglected. So spend time with them. Go slow. I mean, work, but go slow at it. Don't feel like you got to. Don't try to solve every problem that was there when you got there. A lot of those will solve themselves, and a lot of those you'll forget about, and a lot of those will become ripe.
Wow.
At the right time. So take some time. And as I said, what the visit you make, pay attention to where you're going as you go down the street. Notice buildings and notice where the kind of places people live and that kind of thing. Get to know your community.
Brother Don, you just used a phrase I've never heard before applied to ministry and solving ministry problems. You said some of those problems will become ripe. Can you think of an example? I think I know what you mean, but can you think of an example in your own ministry where you didn't tackle the problem immediately, but it became ripe at some point and you were able to deal with it effectively? Does anything come to mind that you could share with us?
Well, it actually was in an interim pastorate. I went there and they were struggling with a deacon situation about rotating deacons or not.
Right.
And they've been fussing about that for a year, I think. Well, anyway, it came to a point where it just had to be dealt with. And so God gave me a solution. I said, anybody who's above the age of 65 is a deacon for life. But under 65, you guys will be appropriately reelected. So we rotate as we elect new deacons under the age of 65. But the guys who've served for years, and that solved the problem because they were concerned. The older ones were concerned about the fact that if I rotate off, nobody knows who I am anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So let's honor him and let him continue serving. But I didn't deal with that until I had to.
Yeah. That's probably some pretty good counsel there. Trying to discern when does a problem, when do you have to lean into it, I think is probably as much skill, spiritual discernment, listening to the Lord. So let's talk to that pastor, Brother Don. It's been there 2 to 5 years in a place of ministry. What should he be thinking about, in your opinion, in that time frame?
Well, that's somewhere along there is the time to evaluate whether or not am I at the right place for the rest of my ministry. By the way, I say to a young pastor, you serve that church as if it's the only pastorate you will ever have. And it probably won't be, but you serve that church as if it's the only pastorate you'll ever have. It is a good time about that third year to evaluate whether or not God wants me to invest my next 10 years of my life here. If so, what are the things that need to get done during these next 10 years? And lay them out one at a time. Don't try to tackle 5 things at a time, but one at a time, what has priority? If it's building a new building, the details of that, lay it out. And by the way, I think the way to, I think in preaching and in leading a church, we is a big word. Mm-hmm. If you find yourself saying, I, me, and you, that's not going to go well long term. But, we need to increase our prayer life. We whatever, we need to do this. That seems to go over well, a whole lot better than saying I or you.
But Don, that's such good counsel. How do you help a pastor who's at that season where he feels stagnant, the church feels a little bit stagnant, he's trying to discern, should I stay or should I go? How do you counsel that pastor when he wants to talk with you about trying to discern long term if he's where he needs to be?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm convinced most pastors leave too quick.
Yeah.
So, first of all, do something in your own life. When I was at Southside Preston, I'll just be specific what church it was. I'd been there 10 years, wound up staying 11 and a half. They had put me through seminary. We had grown considerably, but I just about was burnt out. And I had been pondering with the idea of changing my style of preaching. I had mostly preached topical sermons, biblical but topical. But I had been listening to Adrian Rogers, Jared Vines, people like that, and saying to myself, that's the way I want to preach, right there. That's the way I want to preach. So I switched from topical preaching to preaching through books of the Bible and preaching expository sermons. And so the last year and a half or so that I was there was the time of my growth, even as I was preaching to the people, to switch. And that gave me a new energy to work on that, even while I was convinced God was getting me ready to make a move. And I was getting a number of opportunities to move, but not for the right place.
That's really good. You didn't have the internet at that time to scroll around and look for open. You had the Western Recorder showing up, churches that are available, but you can sure spend a lot of time looking for your next place. But that is great counsel. Find something to do, meaningful, invest in, give your attention to, as God may be calling you. And
also ask the question: is there anything here that I believe God wants done that may not get done if I leave?
Yeah. Wow, that's good. That's Brother Don. That's again, there's some solid gold coming from Dr. Don Mathis. Thank you for that ministry wisdom. Well, you're unique in that you actually left the pastorate and your other calling to enter into full-time evangelism, and you actually stayed busy at it and preached more than, I heard, 750 revivals. Is it more than that?
Well, that includes about 300 when I was a pastor.
Okay, so you preached more than seven. But you were able to stay busy as a vocational evangelist. So, what's the difference between the kind of Sunday by Sunday expository preaching that you were doing versus an evangelistic sermon, a sermon where you're helping folks hear the gospel and get saved? How are those different?
That's pretty much the major difference. Exactly what you've said. As an evangelist, the sermons need to be simpler and clearer and more pointed, and tend to be either topical, preach on heaven, preach on hell, and they don't give themselves to expository preaching per se. Mm. It tends to be more pointed toward decision making or reviving the church, and you don't have time to preach through a book of the Bible. Expository preaching is more what my style was as a pastor, but not so much as an evangelist. I think that's a major difference in preaching. And of course, also that what you said earlier about connecting with the people, you don't have very long to connect with the people if you're an evangelist. Nowadays you've got 5 services and that's it. And you almost have to connect the first service, frankly.
How do you do that? How do you try to connect in that first service when you're starting a revival somewhere?
Well, first of all, I try to find out something about that town. And what I can find out about that church, that's positive. That's positive. I don't go in with negative. If preacher tells me, would you deal with this because we got a problem with it? I don't do that much. That's not my calling as an evangelist. But
you're not pastor number 2 for that church. You're coming in as an
I
evangelist.
brag on the pastor if I can do that honestly. I talk about the qualities of the pastor that I like, and I talk about the fact I like this guy. I don't hesitate. And basically, I do like preachers, so that's not hard for me to do. But back to those 3 things a minute ago. In evangelistic preaching, those are the 3 issues: guilt, afraid to die, purpose in life.
Yeah.
And I try to let that come to the forefront in my evangelistic preaching. Yeah. And more topical, more textual, that kind of, rather than expository.
Don, I've also noticed I used you when I was a pastor. I used you in revival multiple times, and you do a great job. I've recommended you to lots of churches. You're a trustworthy evangelist. You're not going to manipulate an invitation. You're going to preach a solid gospel message and invite folks to respond. But you also do a sermon in a sack for children, which I think is just brilliant. Is that your personality to want to have the children up front, or is there another reason that you use that tool?
I learned to do that at Crofton Baptist Church, by the way. I had a pastor who was pastor at Edgewood and Hopkinsville helped me in revival. He did sermon in a sack. He had learned it from the pastor who gets credit for having invented the sermon in the sack. And so I asked him if I could do it. He gave me his 10 favorites. I still use those. But anyway, I tell young pastors, work the ends to the middle. Be a friend to the children. And be a friend to the senior adults. Grandmother has children and grandchildren, and if she likes you, she'll take care of you.
Mm-hmm.
And the children always have, if you got children, you got some young adults out there. And if you make friends with the kids, for example, we still have Sunday night service, which I think is a good thing at Crofton. If the kids want to come back because they like the preacher, mom and daddy will come too.
That's true.
I work the ends toward the middle, and I like doing the sermon in a sack, and I still do it. Did it as an evangelist, and do it back in Crofton where I started with it.
Well, I loved watching you do it as an evangelist when I was pastor, because you're not doing some syrupy thing for the kids. You're giving them a Bible lesson, and you're connecting it to whatever's in that sack, and those kids love it. I mean, they look forward to coming and hearing what you have to say.
Well, I grew up being afraid of the pastor too.
Okay.
And that relieves that fear. They realize a pastor is just a guy, and he's God called, but he's just a man, and he likes boys and girls, and that's important to me.
Yeah. If a pastor is going to hold an evangelistic revival services, what are 2 or 3 things that he can do to prepare the church for the evangelist coming in?
Well, I asked him to mention the revival as if it was the most important thing of the year, and mention it every service for 6 weeks.
Okay.
Sunday morning, Sunday night, or whatever, Wednesday night, or whatever services he has, mention it every service, have prayer for it, and encourages people to pray for the revival. Then I asked them to do a high attendance day, whatever, Friends Day, Sunday school high attendance day. And I say to the pastor, if you get them there Sunday morning, it'll be up to me to get them back the rest of the week. And that's what I want to start with. And that's pretty much it. Announce it, promote it, pray for it, get to do a high attendance day.
And you've seen the Lord do some good things in revival. Typically, when you're preaching revival, there oftentimes, whenever I used you, folks usually got saved during revival services, and it was a good week for us. Hey, Brother Don, let's talk about your good friend, Rick Hatley. So you've had a lifetime friendship with Brother Rick Hatley, who just recently passed away. And tell us a little bit about Brother Rick's. A lot of folks would know him. Some folks wouldn't know him, but describe him for us and describe your friendship if you can.
Yeah, I met Rick in 1989. Our Minister of Education had left us to go to Porter Memorial, Lexington. I had encouraged him, worked with him through that process and so forth. And he was wonderful Minister of Education. So I was looking for a Minister of Education. And I had Rick's resume. I think it came through the state office, KBC office. And I saw a couple of things in it that I liked. He had been a member at Highview while in seminary, and I liked that. Highview has always been a strong evangelistic church. He was from Western Kentucky, which made it, I thought I could relate to, and so forth. Graduate of Murray State. and Southern. Anyway, so I talked to him on the phone, and we met. He and his wife met me for an interview in this building about 100 feet from where I'm sitting right now.
Okay.
And interviewed him. Was not particularly impressed with him. He's small of stature and a little bit shy, like me. But met with it. But the more I talked with him, the more I discovered this guy knows a lot of stuff. And I discovered along the way he could do anything. I mean, he could lead the music if necessary. He could teach a class. He knew how to organize Sunday school, which is the thing that I was most interested in. 29 years old, 30 years old, no older than 30. And so me, along with our personnel committee, invited him to come up and visit with us. His wife, Carol, was great with child, their oldest child, Jessica. And so we had to put off his coming for about 3 months until Jessica was born. And he came on staff with me, and I discovered right away this guy could do most anything. And he was very much a team player, loyal. And that's what I expect of folks who serve on my staff, that they be a team player and be loyal. I'll watch your back, you watch my back, that kind of thing. Anyway, but I didn't stay there but 3 more years after that, till you have not mentioned that. I went to West Virginia to be executive director, treasurer of the West Virginia Convention of Southern Baptists. You've never heard of this before, but they were fussing and fighting with each other over the conservative, moderate stuff. Of course, I'm definitely a conservative, but I have tended to get along with people who are not as conservative as me.
Sure.
And they had been out a year and a half, and I wanted everywhere in the world. I tried everywhere in the world to say no, but I just couldn't. I won't go into a long story there. But anyway, I went to West Virginia. Well, I needed somebody to be the finance person for the convention, to do the state paper, and incidentally to do some educational work with the churches. So I asked him to go with me to West Virginia. Twins were born there. We stayed in West Virginia 3 years, only 3 years, but God solved the problem. And anyway, the fellowship was healed. I felt like I had done what God sent me there to do, and I asked God to let me go back to the pasture. And so I then came to Central Baptist Winchester, and needed a minister of education. So I convinced Rick at the committee that Rick was supposed to be with me at Winchester. And we didn't stay long, but the attendance had declined for 6 straight years, Sunday school attendance. Well, we got that back up and got highest it had ever been, frankly. And they had a debt that we had to deal with, and we got a lot of that paid off. The Lord just blessed. And I had intended, by the time I'd been there 3 years, to stay there and retire when Lifeway called. That's when I went to Lifeway.
Okay.
To work with pastors and staff ministers.
And that's when Rick probably started pastoring churches, I suppose, was from.
Well, he stayed in Central Winchester for 10 years, so he stayed 7 years beyond the time I was there, and then he felt led to pastorate and was a DOM for a while.
And a very effective pastor, Brother Don. I mean, he had a great ministry at Crofton. So there's research that says 70% of pastors do not have a close personal friend. Why is that a problem?
Well, it's a problem essentially like it is for anybody else who doesn't have a close friend. But the pastor, because he stands in the pulpit and is used to being heard. By the way, he should not normally have his best friend be a member of his congregation. That may work out and that may not work out. And particularly if you need to share things that do not need to be shared in general. You don't need to talk to that person who's in your congregation about that, generally speaking. Now, there may be exceptions to that. And usually not with a staff member, but he was with me 3 places. And as I said, our kids, although different in age, they blended together. And he just became my closest friend. And for 33 years, I talked to him essentially every day.
Yeah.
Within the last year or so, if it'd been a day that I had not talked to him, I'd say to my wife about 8 o'clock, I better call Rick. Yeah. Anything he could keep confidences. If he was trying to go through a decision process, we just talked about everything. And everybody needs somebody like that. And to be real honest, I'm going through a process of grief right now.
There's no doubt about it,
I
Brother
lost
Don.
my best friend. Preached
You,
this week.
your best friend's gone on home before you. Well, I'm grateful for you and grateful for Brother Rick and grateful for your friendship. It's a model for the rest of us to pay attention to who God puts in our path and see who we can find.